it's Jack from Cultaholic.com back once again with more tasty wrestling news. Now, of course, we do have one news video already up on the channel today. Go and check that one out, but there was too much news for one video. So, without any further ado, let's get into some more lovely headlines. First of all, Vince McMahon is reportedly very enthusiastic about a certain SmackDown superstar. Secondly, details on a match at Extreme Rules, the horror show at Extreme Rules have been revealed. And finally, we have an update on Kairi Sane's WWE future. So first of all, yes, Vince McMahon is apparently very hot on a certain SmackDown superstar, and that person in question is recent call-up from NXT, Matt Riddle. Now, I should probably mention before delving into this story that Matt Riddle is, of course, the subject of accusations that came out in light of the Speaking Out movement. But unlike various other WWE superstars who were also accused of various different things, he has not been suspended or released. So it's an ongoing situation. I just thought it was best to mention that before we then delve into the story. So a report from WrestlingNews.co have suggested that Vince McMahon is not only a big fan of Matt Riddle, but specifically the promo that he cut on last week's SmackDown as well. If you didn't see it, Riddle did an interview in the ring with Michael Cole where Cole asked him why he wrestles barefoot, and Riddle told a story about when he was younger and he got frostbitten feet very badly, almost lost his feet, and ever since then, whenever he wears shoes, he gets that same like burning frostbite sensation. So he just doesn't ever wear shoes, and that's the reason behind it. Now, apparently before this story was on air, it wasn't written for Matt Riddle. Apparently it's a real story that actually happened to him, and he told Vince this story privately behind the scenes, and Vince loved the story so much that he encouraged him to make it a part of the show. And apparently it's not just this promo, but apparently Vince has been a fan of Matt Riddle for quite some time, which goes against a lot of the reports that were coming out only a few months ago about Matt Riddle having heat from everywhere, heat from Lesnar, Goldberg, the top brass who didn't want him calling out these huge stars. So it's a bit of an interesting situation. WrestlingNews.co's report includes a quote from a source from back in November saying that Vince had compared Matt Riddle to Shawn Michaels. The quote says, "Vince likes guys like Shawn who have that rebel mentality, and he sees some of Shawn in Matt. Matt can rub some people the wrong way, but he's a good guy and he will do great when Vince calls him up. I think he's a future world champion. Vince will try to tweak him, but his personality will get him far." So very interesting stuff there. I don't know where this comparison between Riddle and Shawn Michaels has come about, because I don't know. I mean, I guess in the ring they're not very similar at all, but then backstage you could say they could both be viewed as troublemakers, or at least Shawn definitely was in his heyday, stirring up a bit of trouble, pushing people's buttons and that sort of thing, I suppose. So yeah, I guess I can see where Vince is coming from if this quote is to be believed. It remains to be seen what happens for Riddle going forwards, but he did get off to a very hot start on SmackDown, of course, beating AJ Styles in a non-title match, despite AJ, of course, being the IC champion. Switching brands now from SmackDown over to Raw, and let's talk about a match that was agreed on Raw for the upcoming pay-per-view. Not Extreme Rules, the horror show at Extreme Rules. Wasn't it around this time of year that WWE did Great Balls of Fire about 3 years ago? Does Vince get bored in the summertime and just come up with weird show names that are very out there and a little bit out of touch with reality? And this ongoing feud with Seth Rollins and Rey Mysterio will apparently also come to a head at Extreme Rules. A theme of their feud so far has been eyes, people's eyes getting shoved into ring steps, attempts at shoving eyes into ring steps, and it's all led to an eye for an eye match at the horror show at Extreme Rules. Now, a lot of people were thinking, oh, it's got a flashy name, but it's probably not an actual eye for an eye match, because various different stipulations have wild out there names. Iron Man matches aren't involving the competitors literally coated in iron, and 3 Stages of Hell matches don't take place in an entirely different realm. They're very much grounded in reality. So you get what I'm trying to say here in quite clunky fashion. An eye for an eye match surely wouldn't be literally an eye for an eye. Well, in fantastic news, WWE.com have said the following. The horror show at Extreme Rules added a new level of terror as Rey Mysterio and Seth Rollins will meet in an eye for an eye match. Mysterio teamed with Kevin Owens to defeat Rollins and Murphy for the right to choose the gory stipulation, where the winner can only be determined by extracting the opponent's eye. It's actually real. It's actually happening. This is what this stipulation is. So that's what's going on. That could make the horror show at Extreme Rules one of the most memorable pay-per-views of the entire year, for better or for worse, of course, because we've seen so many memorable pay-per-views already this year for various different reasons. I mean, we've already had, a 2-day WrestleMania with no crowd. We've had the greatest match ever at Backlash. And now, by the looks of it, we're going to get literally someone's eye taken out on pay-per-view. Not literally. I'm sure there'll be smoke and mirrors involved, but it seems like someone's going to pull someone's eye out. So I don't know what else to say. I'll just give a quick rundown of the rest of the card for the horror show at Extreme Rules. Drew McIntyre will defend the WWE Championship against Dolph Ziggler in a match where Ziggler picks the stipulation, but he hasn't done so yet. Asuka will defend the Raw Women's Championship against Sasha Banks. Bayley will defend the SmackDown Women's Championship against Nikki Cross. Braun Strowman and Bray Wyatt will clash in a Wyatt Swamp fight. Apollo Crews will defend the US title against former US champion MVP. And of course, in an eye for an eye match, Seth Rollins will take on Rey Mysterio. Next up, Becky Lynch was talking to Sports Illustrated recently about the history of her ring name in WWE, because of course her real name isn't Becky Lynch, it's Rebecca Quinn. So how did Rebecca Quinn become Becky Lynch? How did that name come about? Well, Becky said to Sports Illustrated, "When I was coming up with my name in WWE, I came up with a bunch of mad Irish names that I thought were cool. Since my last name is Quinn, I tried to get that in there as my first name. Quinn Cullen was one, and that was based off the mythological person from Irish mythology, Cú Cullen, a badass character from the Irish tradition. But that didn't fly. Becky says they wanted a name associated with my own name, Rebecca, so I became Becky. And two of the names that they came back to me with were Becky Lynch and then something like Madeline or Madeline, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Anyway, I said no to that, and the other name they came back with was Robin Daly. I actually did like that one, but I thought it would be better to have a part of my own name in there, so she chose Becky Lynch." It's really interesting stuff, isn't it? How much a name can change your perception of a wrestler, because I can 100% imagine Becky Lynch winning the women's title, headlining WrestleMania, but I don't know if I can picture Robin Daly doing the same. You never know. That could just be with the bias that we have already of knowing who Becky Lynch is and following her journey. But it is true that sometimes in wrestling a snappy name can be a lot of other things in helping get you over, or it can work the other way. Just look at what happened when the Viking Experience were calling themselves that. So I think that Becky Lynch is probably the best choice of all the names she mentioned there, but I think it's cool that she tried to incorporate the whole Irish mythology into her new gimmick. Of course, it's a weird time in WWE for names over recent years because, of course, people are losing their first names from people like Antonio Cesaro, Alexander Rusev, before he was just Rusev before he left the company, of course. More recently, Murphy, who used to be Buddy Murphy, Andrade, who used to be Andrade Cien Almas. It's weird because you've got some people on the roster who've got one name, like Andrade, like Murphy, and then in NXT/205 Live, you've got Isaiah Swerve Scott. There seems to be no consistency going on. But anyway, I thought that was a cool little story to include about Becky Lynch talking to Sports Illustrated about her name. And kudos to Tom, who found it and told me to put it in this video. Thank you, Tom, mate. Now, I don't want to do this, but let's dive into the convoluted mess that has been the reporting of Kairi Sane's current WWE contract status. Because not too long ago, everybody was reporting that Kairi Sane was out the door. We would never be seeing her on TV again for WWE. She's probably moving back to Japan to be with her husband. Her contract's over. She's pretty much out of WWE. And then, a few hours later, she showed up on Monday Night Raw. Everyone at the time believed that Kairi Sane was leaving, and we believed that as well. We believed those reports. We reported it to you, but now it seems like conflicting stories have emerged. So it's only right that we take a look at those as well. So while places like Fightful and the Wrestling Observer clearly got information from some of their sources that Kairi was pretty much out the door, TalkSport sources are saying that Sane leaving WWE is far from set in stone. According to TalkSport, Sane was said to have been quite shaken up by her last concussion and considered her future as a result. WWE are intent on taking care of Sane and are set to offer her better money than she could get anywhere else in an attempt to keep her. Now, the unclear thing here is what role would WWE be keeping Sane on in? Would it be a wrestling role, or would it be this sort of ambassadorial role to Japan to try and break into the wrestling scene there? But according to TalkSport, WWE do still see value in Kairi Sane as a performer, and of course, why wouldn't they? She's arguably one of the best pure wrestlers on the entire roster. Kairi's going to be back in action on Raw next week, teaming with Asuka to challenge the women's tag team champion Sasha Banks and Bayley ahead of, presumably this is part of the build, to Asuka versus Sasha Banks at Extreme Rules, at the horror show at Extreme Rules. Now, an interesting part of this whole, all the reporting that was going on earlier this week and last week about Kairi Sane's contract status was the idea that she would be written off TV with some kind of horrific injury and Asuka would have to fight and gain revenge for whatever had happened to Kairi. With this tag match, I still think that could happen. I don't know, it might be a bit of a reach, I might be thinking too much about that, but if it did happen, I wouldn't be too surprised. But regardless of what happens, it seems like from one side of the story, we've swung totally over to the other because now it seems to suggest that WWE are intent on keeping Kairi around and do still see her value as a performer. And finally, you may have seen yesterday on AEW Dark that Brian Pillman Jr. made his debut in a losing effort to Shawn Spears. Now, Brian Pillman Jr. has been one of the most promising up-and-coming stars of the independent scene in North America for a little while now, so it was only going to be a matter of time before his name was at least linked to All Elite Wrestling. And then, out of nowhere it seemed really, in the aftermath of last week's part 1 of Fyter Fest, a photograph emerged online of Brian Pillman Jr. backstage hanging out with Chris Jericho, and also he was wearing ring gear, which led to rumours that he would be debuting on Dark, and then this week, of course, that was proven true. But it's not quite as simple as that, because of course, Brian Pillman Jr. is not a total free agent. In fact, before the lockdown, he was wrestling for MLW, Major League Wrestling. Well, recently, Pillman Jr. spoke to Wrestle Talk and gave a little bit of an update on his status regarding where he lies between MLW and AEW. And then, after we've talked about that, MLW themselves released a statement regarding Brian Pillman Jr. So, speaking to Wrestle Talk, Pillman Jr. said, Major League Wrestling was a wonderful opportunity. Notice the past tense, there was a wonderful opportunity. It provided me with the TV experience, with the style of matches that I was having, and the opponents were incredible. I had some of my best matches there, without a doubt. I really wanted to continue my career with MLW because things were getting hot, we were getting pushed, but in wrestling, when things have good momentum behind it, it's really not about the money and stuff. It's about getting to express your art at the highest level. Very interesting stuff there. But then he said that, you know, obviously the world hit a roadblock. I think that just what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic is that they got a little apprehensive about running shows. And meanwhile, you've got Impact, AEW, and WWE that are running shows with no fans. So it was hard for me to sit still and wait for them to bring me an opportunity. So I just went out and chased the opportunities that were available to me. So it sounds like Brian Pillman Jr. has been very proactive there, thinking, well, I can't wrestle for the promotion I'm currently at, so I'm going to reach out and try and wrestle for one of the 3 that are still running shows. And from his words there, it does seem like Brian Pillman Jr. is not really considering himself part of MLW anymore, although he did state in the interview with Wrestle Talk that he claims to have not yet been informed of his status with the promotion. Then MLW released a statement, or their chief operating officer did anyway, Jared St. Laurent, and basically said, Brian is not released and is fully aware of our schedule, which includes events October 3rd and December 5th, pending the state of the pandemic. So very opposite language here from MLW saying, no, you're still with us, what are you doing? We put the health of our talent and staff and their family and our fans before bookings, which is why we're not running at the moment. We've been in contact with Brian to relay this. If he elects to perform elsewhere under the terms of his deal, he certainly has our full blessing to do so. So it seems like MLW is saying, yeah, cool, go for it, wrestle for whoever you want for the time being, but when these dates come around that we've booked you on, you pretty much better be back here. Come on, Brian. So very interesting stuff there. We'll have to monitor that situation and see where it goes. And that's it for the news today. Thank you very much for watching this video. I've been Jack from Cultaholic.com. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on any of these stories in the comments section down below. If you want more news and you haven't seen Tom's earlier video today on the channel, do go and check that out. But for now, stay safe out there, stay positive, and I'll see you soon.